Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, and here we are talking about our next lesson on the Middle and New Kingdoms of ancient Egypt. So let's go ahead and let's get started with this. Now, in our last lesson, we talked about the geography of ancient Egypt and how the Nile River was the source of life and water and soil and stuff for the Egyptians, and that's where the Egyptian civilization flourished. And we talked about the Old Kingdom and the pyramids. And the Old Kingdom, going into this lesson, ended up with the pharaohs deep in debt. Their lavish programs of building pyramids and things like that left them with no money. And nobles in government uh, positions thought that they could do better, and so they took power from the pharaohs and actually ruled Egypt themselves for about 160 years. The nobles passed it among themselves. They acted like they were pharaohs and things like that. But around 2050 BC. So we're going to talk about 2,000 years of 2,100 year, 2,000 to 2,200 years of history here. A powerful pharaoh took over and started a period of rule himself, named himself God and things like that. And it led to about a 250, 300 year rule, peaceful period of stability and order in Egypt's history that we call the Middle Kingdom. Whereas last time we talked about the Old Kingdom, right here we're talking about the Middle Kingdom. And during the Middle Kingdom, it was kind of a continuation of the Old Kingdom's policies and with some small changes. And the Middle Kingdom itself lasted for about 300, 250, 300 years until about 1700 BC when invaders from Southwest Asia conquered Lower Egypt and took Memphis, the capital, and ruled themselves under foreign rule. And these people, we don't quite know what they are. The Egyptians call them the Hyksos, and they might be Hittites, like if you remember from the last chapter, or another group from around Israel or Turkey or even Greece. We're not quite sure, but they ruled Egypt for a time. And after a while, the Egyptians were able to finally overthrow these foreign rulers. And it was mainly through an Egyptian nobleman named Ahmose, who was able to drive them away. He named himself Pharaoh in 1550 BC. So after about 200 years of rule by these foreign people, Ahmose comes along and raises up an Egyptian army and is able to kick them out. Ahmose's reign began what we call the New Kingdom. And when we think of ancient Egypt, this is what we're thinking about. It's a 500-year period that was the height of Egypt's power. Okay? And Egypt, at its height of its power, was perhaps as powerful, if not more powerful, than even the Mesopotamians that we talked about in last chapter with the Babylonians and stuff like that. So because Egypt is so flat, being invaded was a problem much like Mesopotamia. You have the Sinai Peninsula that makes it very difficult to defend against. And then in the west, you have the desert that's nice and flat too. And in the south, it's nice and flat. So keeping Egypt safe was a bit of a tricky problem for the pharaohs. So Egypt decided to take control of the trade routes, the highways, and the areas that passed through the deserts where there were water, that Egypt could control them and prevent enemy armies from coming through. And as a result, greatly expanded their military and became the leading military power in the region. And through trade and rule, their empire expanded all the way to the Euphrates River in Iraq with Mesopotamia, in the northeast to Nubia, which is a land south of modern-day Egypt, down there in the south. Trade routes, as a result, made Egypt extremely wealthy because they were able to control the goods that came and they were able to tax it and stuff like that. So, bouncing through the New Kingdom right here, in about ancient Egyptians' history, we have about 250 pharaohs. Only three pharaohs were formal pharaohs were women. Several of their mothers would rule in the pharaoh's place as a child, but only three of them managed to be full-blown pharaohs on their own. One famous female pharaoh was in this time in the New Kingdom was named Queen Hatshepsut, and Queen Hatshepsut greatly expanded Egyptian trade. And we can look at her picture right here. Queen Hatshepsut, this is a burial of her at her tomb. And she wore a ceremonial beard. No, that isn't a real beard. She wore a ceremonial beard as a symbol of her power. And she ruled just like any other male pharaoh. And she was famous for greatly expanding Egyptian trade. Now, like we said earlier, Egypt's military fought through a series of wars throughout the New Kingdom. And the first war, of course, was under Athmos. And here's a picture of Athmos. And here's a painting of him fighting off invaders on his chariot. And the reason why Athmos seems so big is for a reason we'll discuss in the next lesson. But the other guy who fought against invaders was Ramses the Great. And that's this guy right here. He's fighting off invaders in this picture. And he was considered Egypt's greatest pharaoh. Okay, Ramses the Great spent much of his rule defending Egypt from invaders and fighting and expanding Egypt's borders. To Ramses the Great, he figured that the best way to keep Egypt was being invaded was to invade other people and prevent them from invading you. Okay, and he built several temples, and we'll talk about some temples later. And he also, after he died, he had statues built for him that were huge. Here is in an Egyptian museum. You see the guy right here, and this is how big his statue was of himself. And so Ramses the Great was considered to be the greatest pharaoh. However, Ramses' rule was not enough to keep Egypt going because of this geography and it being nice and flat. Soon after his death, Egypt fell into violence and disorder, and you had series of dynasties of pharaohs coming on and off, and Egypt was never as powerful as it was in the New Kingdom. And we'll talk about later this year the final pharaoh was actually a woman, Cleopatra, but we'll talk about her way later on. So we talked about with the Middle and New Kingdoms, the pharaohs and stuff like that. But what was it like in daily life in Egypt? Well, during the Middle New Kingdom, Egypt's society became more complex. We saw the pyramid of the social structure. It became more and more stratified, it became more and more formal, where people couldn't move between those classes. The economy grew. Skilled jobs like scribes and architects were honored. It was considered to be you were considered to be very highly praised or a really good person if you were an architect or a scribe or someone in the middle class. And these jobs were passed on in families, usually from father to son. In fact, most jobs were passed on from father to son. If you were a child, you grew up and you did whatever your father did. Didn't matter whether you wanted to be an architect. If your family was a farmer, you'd be a farmer. Now, despite this idea of middle-class families and being honored and skilled labor producing more and more famous things, most people, in fact, were just poor farmers. And for them, life was pretty bad. They had little rights. They paid a lot of taxes. I mean, after all, if you're going to build a huge statue like that, that costs money. And that comes from the farmers. They had little rights. They paid lots of taxes. And occasionally, the pharaoh's army would show up and require you to work on special labor duties. If the pharaoh wanted the temple built, you would have to go build it. A road, levee, same thing like that. The only people in Egyptian society lower than farmers, and as we can see, farmers weren't really cared for. All they were slaves. Slaves were the only people they cared about less in Egyptian society. Overall, men had most of the rights in ancient Egypt, but women did have some rights, like owning property. They could divorce their husbands or even make a contract on their own without their husband's permission, which is something we didn't see in a lot of other societies. So that's our lesson. Really short and to the point. We talked about the Middle Kingdom, where the Old Kingdom ended up in debt, and you had nobles take over about 160 years. A pharaoh takes over, forms the Middle Kingdom. Invaders come in and ends the Middle Kingdom around 750 BC. Ahmose, this guy, takes over and kicks out the invaders about 1550 BC, forming the New Kingdom, which is the height of Egypt's power. Egypt's empire spread through trade and the military. You had one of three female pharaohs, Queen Hatshepsut. She greatly expanded Egyptian trade, and military growth was through this guy, Ramses the Great, who spent most of his rule fighting and spreading Egypt's borders in order to prevent it from being taken over. But over time, even Egypt, under Ramses' leadership, couldn't hang on, and it ended up going into violence and disorder. So that's your lesson. If you have any questions, please let me know. And we got one more lesson in this chapter, and thanks for watching.